Silverleaf Meadows was the sort of neighborhood that developers touted in glossy brochures. Picturesque single-family homes, manicured lawns fringed by narrow sidewalks, and a winding central road lined with ornamental street lamps. The development had grown steadily over the past decade, attracting a wide spectrum of residents. Young families chasing suburban dreams, retirees seeking tranquility, and a few individuals needing accessible spaces for disabilities. And yet, behind this facade of calm perfection, roiled the subtle tensions that often sprang up in homeowners' associations. For all the neatness in the neighborhood, those living within it knew that not everything was sunshine and roses. Chief among the sources of tension was an HOA member named Patricia Hensley, though a whispered nickname often echoed among neighbors, Karen. Patricia, or Karen, as some called her, had taken it upon herself to uphold what she saw as the true standards of Silverleaf Meadows. If anyone dared deviate from the official guidelines, be it a slightly mismatched fence color or a misparked vehicle, Karen could be counted on to issue pointed remarks or fire off stern emails. She was in her early 50s, with meticulously maintained hair and a tailored wardrobe, always striving to present herself as the neighborhood's moral compass. The rest of the HOA board tolerated her, in part because she was detail-oriented and did occasionally catch legitimate issues, but also because they recognized she was a volatile force. Cross her, and you risked lengthy, drama-fueled spats. Over the years, Karen had triggered numerous petty disputes, insisting that kids' chalk drawings on sidewalks lowered property values, complaining about early morning dog walkers, or scolding neighbors for leaving garbage cans at the curb a few minutes past pickup time. Still, for all her meddling, few guessed how far Karen might go if sufficiently annoyed. That limit would soon be tested by a new neighbor, George Millstone, a disabled resident whose slow parking would ignite Karen's fury in a truly shocking incident. George Millstone arrived at Silverleaf Meadows on a bright day in late spring. He was in his late 40s, a soft-spoken man who used forearm crutches because of a spinal injury he'd sustained years ago. Previously living in a cramped city apartment, George had saved meticulously to buy a single-story home that offered more space and an accessible layout. When he found a house in Silverleaf Meadows, complete with ramps and wide doorways installed by a previous homeowner, he leapt at the chance. His first few days were a blur of unpacking and mild exploration. Friendly neighbors waved hello. A young couple across the street offered to help carry moving boxes. Even the HOA president, an elderly gentleman named Robert Penfield, stopped by to greet George, presenting a welcome packet of rules and local resources. George took particular note of the accessible parking spot near the clubhouse, a short walk from his own driveway. The HOA had designated a few spaces around the community for disabled residents or visitors to use, especially useful if his driveway was blocked or if he needed to park closer to communal areas. Overall, George was cautiously optimistic about his new life at Silverleaf Meadows. That optimism, however, did not anticipate the scrutiny of Karen. Observing from her living room window, Karen had watched George's moving truck linger in the roadway a bit longer than usual, thanks to the driver's careful unloading. She'd frowned, but said nothing at the time. It was only a small sign of the friction to come. George gradually settled into a routine. Twice a week, he drove to a local rehab center for physical therapy. Upon returning home, he often stopped at the grocery store to pick up supplies, carefully balancing his forearm crutches and grocery bags. Because his driveway sloped downward and was somewhat narrow, sometimes he parked curbside near his front walkway, just for the few minutes it took to transfer groceries inside. For George, that short walk from the curb to his front door, groceries in hand, felt safer and easier than negotiating his sloped driveway. He was mindful of not obstructing traffic. He'd pull his car in close to the curb, hazard lights on, and methodically unload. He never lingered more than 5 to 10 minutes, ensuring other vehicles could pass on the wide community road. Karen, though, found this practice intolerable. She believed that the roads in Silverleaf Meadows existed for smooth-flowing traffic alone, not personal convenience. One afternoon, she spied George's car idling at the curb, trunk popped open. She marched outside, approached him with a fixed glare. George, loading a bag of canned goods onto his walker's seat, noticed Karen's approach. He gave a polite nod. "Good afternoon." Karen sniffed. "You know," she began coldly. This isn't a public parking lot. It's a roadway. You can't just leave your vehicle here. He offered a small smile. I'm nearly done. Just unloading groceries. She crossed her arms. This is unacceptable. Cars might need to pass, or an emergency vehicle could come through. The HOA guidelines clearly state no curbside parking beyond immediate loading or unloading. George blinked. Well, that's exactly what I'm doing. Immediate unloading. I'll be out of the way in just a minute. Karen huffed, though the road was indeed passable. It's still an eyesore. You can't linger. This is a private community, and we keep things orderly. Next time, use your driveway or one of the designated parking spots near the clubhouse. George nodded, not wanting conflict. All right, I'll be quick. He resumed gathering his groceries, uneasy under her scathing gaze. After a few moments, Karen stormed off, apparently satisfied she'd made her point. George tried to shrug it off. He had the impression that she was the kind of neighbor who always found something to criticize. Little did he suspect how swiftly her frustration would escalate. Over the next few weeks, George continued his routine. Once or twice, he tried parking on his sloped driveway, but found it physically challenging to juggle crutches and heavy grocery bags on the incline. Sometimes the car door swung shut on him as he reached in for items. Once, a bag slipped from his grasp, sending produce rolling onto the grass. So George reverted to parking curbside momentarily. Each time, he left hazard lights on, worked as fast as his limited mobility allowed, and never blocked the entire lane. Sometimes neighbors passing by would wave or even offer to carry a bag. Still, George felt a pang of guilt, recalling Karen's complaint. But no official notice had arrived from the HOA, so he assumed perhaps she had let it go. In reality, Karen was stewing. She lived further down the street, but her daily walks often took her past George's house around the same time he arrived from therapy. Each instance of seeing his car at the curb, trunk open, fueled her resentment. She'd timed him once, 12 minutes. That's outrageous, she noted to herself, ignoring that he was physically disabled. Karen drafted an email to the HOA board. Subject: continuing problem with curbside parking. Dear board, I've repeatedly observed one resident, Mr. Millstone, parking in front of his home for extended periods while unloading groceries. This disrupts traffic flow and violates our no curbside parking policy, Section 4.2.1. I kindly request immediate enforcement. Regards, Patricia Karen Hensley. The board members, led by Robert, politely replied they'd investigate. On checking the guidelines, they noted that the rule prohibited prolonged curbside parking, but allowed brief loading/unloading, especially if the resident had mobility challenges. Robert told Karen it appeared George's usage was permissible under an accessibility accommodation that the HOA had set some years back. Fuming, Karen felt stonewalled. She decided to take matters into her own hands, a decision that would soon erupt in scandal. Karen's mounting anger was fueled by her sense of being dismissed. She believed the board had grown lazy, letting inconvenient rules slide. Could they not see how George's slow parking was an eyesore and a hazard? She dreaded the possibility that other residents might follow his example, turning the neat roads of Silverleaf Meadows into a cluttered mess of parked cars. In conversation with a neighbor, Linda, Karen ranted, "We pay good money here for a certain standard. People think sympathy for a disability means ignoring rules. But rules are rules. He can find another way to unload. I'm sure he's able." Linda, uneasy, murmured noncommittally. She found Karen's attitude harsh, but feared confrontation. Word of Karen's hostility spread quietly among neighbors, some disapproving, others uncertain. Meanwhile, George remained politely unaware of the storm brewing, only vaguely sensing Karen's hostility. On a warm Friday afternoon, events would come to a head in dramatic fashion. George returned from the grocery store, his trunk full of produce, canned goods, and household items, worn out from therapy. As usual, he parked curbside, hazard lights blinking. He intended to ferry items inside in 2 or 3 quick trips. Karen, observing from a corner across the street, felt her temper snap. She marched toward George's car, eyes gleaming with the fury of someone determined to enforce her version of order. George pulled out one cloth grocery bag, hooking it over his forearm as he steadied himself on a crutch. That's when Karen swooped in, her voice laced with anger. "Enough. You've been told not to do this. You're blocking the road again." Startled, George looked up. "Oh, Miss Hensley, hi. I'm almost done, just a few bags to go. She glared. I've had it with your slow parking nonsense. You're always taking forever, clogging up the street. Her voice trembled with rage. Some of us have places to be, you know. George's brow furrowed. I'm sorry. I can't move any faster. He gestured to his crutches. It's just the easiest way for me to unload. I promise I'm nearly done. In a flash of impulsive wrath, Karen lunged toward the open trunk, grabbed 2 heavy grocery bags, and yanked them out. Before George could protest, she flung them onto the pavement. One bag burst on impact, oranges and cans rolling across the street. The other spilled out bread and egg cartons that cracked, leaking onto the asphalt. Astonished, George gasped, struggling to maintain his balance. Hey, stop. But Karen wasn't done. She grabbed a 3rd bag from the trunk, this one full of frozen items, and hurled it with all her might. It soared across the road, landing near the curb. Boxes of frozen meals scattered, some landing under a parked car. George could only watch in horror. Passers-by cried out, sprinting to pick up items. A neighbor across the street, Brent, rushed forward, shouting, "What are you doing? Stop!" Karen's chest heaved, eyes wild. "Maybe now you'll learn you can't keep stalling traffic," she spat. With that, she stomped off, leaving George shaken, groceries strewn everywhere. The moment Karen stormed away, a small crowd of stunned onlookers converged around George and his spilled groceries. Brent carefully lifted a carton of cracked eggs, lamenting the mess. Another neighbor, Sarah, scooped up bruised oranges rolling down the gutter. George, trembling from shock, fought tears. He felt a surge of humiliation. Did this woman truly hate him so much, just for being slow? He tried to kneel and gather items, but a neighbor insisted, No, let us do it. You'll hurt yourself." One by one, they retrieved scattered cans, dented boxes, and soiled produce. A mother with her toddler sighed. "That's the meanest thing I've ever seen in this neighborhood." Her toddler picked up an orange, handing it to George. "Here," the child said shyly. George thanked them all softly, voice choked with emotion. He couldn't believe how a routine grocery unloading had escalated into a public spectacle of cruelty. More neighbors arrived, hearing the commotion. Some recognized Karen's retreating form. Several pulled out phones, snapping photos of the aftermath, determined to provide evidence if needed. Despite the chaos, George managed to salvage some items. Others were ruined. Milk cartons had split, eggs cracked, produce battered. The neighbors formed a mini assembly line, placing what was left intact into fresh bags. Brent offered to store the frozen items in his freezer for a moment while George composed himself. "I'm so sorry this happened," Sarah murmured, resting a supportive hand on George's arm. "We'll stand by you. That woman had no right." George nodded, tears in his eyes. I appreciate it," he whispered. "Thank you all." Within hours, the story of Karen's assault on George's groceries spread throughout Silverleaf Meadows like wildfire. Neighbors recounted the scene in vivid detail. How Karen had literally thrown groceries onto the road. How George looked heartbroken. How passers-by scrambled to pick up scattered food. Photos circulated on the community's private social media group, showing cracked eggs and dented soup cans on the pavement. The reaction was one of universal outrage. The HOA president, Robert Penfield, was inundated with calls and messages demanding Karen face consequences. The association's Facebook page lit up with condemnation. "This is insane. Harassing a disabled neighbor? She should be removed from the board. What if someone with a walker or wheelchair was in her way? Would she push them over too? Karen's outdone herself this time. Enough is enough." Realizing the gravity of the situation, Robert convened an emergency HOA board meeting for the following week. He personally contacted George to express regret and offer help. But George, still reeling, wasn't sure what he wanted. Pressing charges? Filing a formal complaint? He felt overwhelmed, uncertain if he had the energy for legal battles. Meanwhile, Karen retreated to her home, ignoring knocks on her door. Some neighbors reported seeing her pace by her window, phone in hand, apparently calling allies or drafting defensive emails. It was rumored she insisted she was provoked, that George's slow parking was a hazard, and that she had to do something. But few believed her justification could excuse physically throwing a disabled man's groceries across the street. The day after the incident, George awoke to find a package on his doorstep. a fresh box of groceries, including eggs, milk, fruit, and bread. An unsigned note read, "We're sorry for what happened. Please accept these replacements from your caring neighbors." Touched, George nearly teared up. That afternoon, neighbors devised a plan. They recognized that George's biggest challenge was safely unloading groceries with his disability. So a group of them proposed forming a curbside volunteer system. The concept was simple. Each time George returned from his therapy appointments or grocery runs, he could text or call a small roster of neighbors who'd be on standby to help unload. If a couple of people pitched in, the process would go faster, and George wouldn't have to risk Karen's wrath or struggle with the slope alone. Word of this plan spread quickly. A sign-up sheet was posted at the clubhouse. Within a day, more than a dozen neighbors wrote their names and phone numbers, indicating times they were typically available. People from all walks of life, retirees, stay-at-home parents, remote workers, volunteered. They saw it as an act of solidarity and compassion. When Brent explained the idea to George, showing him the sign-up list, George was overwhelmed. You do this for me?" he asked, voice trembling with gratitude. Brent nodded. "Of course. That's what a neighborhood is for. We won't let one cruel act define us." Meanwhile, Karen found herself ostracized. The difference was stark. Neighbors who once waved politely now gave her a wide berth. Some openly glared, others whispered about her behind turned backs. Even friends she'd counted on to side with her seemed to keep their distance. On the HOA message board, she posted a lengthy rant defending her actions, claiming George had repeatedly violated community rules and that she merely moved his groceries out of the way to clear the road. The response was a flood of condemnation, calling her out for lying, pointing to photos of spilled groceries as proof of her aggression. Karen quickly took down her post, but the damage was done. At the same time, the board prepared for the emergency meeting. Robert Penfield told Karen in private that her outburst constituted a serious breach of HOA conduct. He insisted she either publicly apologize or face possible expulsion from her board seat. Karen fumed, accusing the board of caving to a pity party and claiming George had manipulated them. In turn, Robert threatened to share the entire account with the local police if Karen refused to comply. "This could be considered assault or harassment," he reminded her. "If George decides to press charges, we'd have no choice but to support him with the evidence we have." Karen, cornered, felt a growing desperation. Yet she still refused to see her actions as truly wrong. She believed she'd been forced into an extreme measure by the HOA's neglect. A week after the incident, residents packed the community center for the emergency HOA meeting. It was standing room only, neighbors crowding the sides, all eager to see how the board would address Karen's behavior. George sat in the front row, accompanied by Brent and Sarah, who'd helped him that day. He clutched his forearm crutches, feeling a swirl of nerves. At the front, Robert Penfield rapped his gavel, calling the meeting to order. Beside him sat 3 other board members, their expressions grim. Karen was at the far right end, arms folded, lips pressed thin. She refused eye contact with George. Robert began by summarizing the matter. "We've called this meeting to address a serious complaint against Ms. Patricia Hensley regarding an incident on Maple Drive last Friday. This incident involved the physical mishandling of Mr. George Millstone's groceries, resulting in property damage and emotional distress." A hush fell. Robert continued, "We'll hear statements from witnesses, then from Ms. Hensley and Mr. Millstone, and the board will determine an appropriate course of action." Neighbors recounted the scene, some describing Karen's outburst in shocked detail. Cell phone photos were displayed, images of groceries strewn across the asphalt, with onlookers picking them up. The audience murmured in disapproval at the graphic evidence. Karen sat stiffly, occasionally rolling her eyes or shaking her head. When it was her turn to speak, she stood and declared, "Everything's being exaggerated. That man consistently blocked traffic, ignoring rules. I only tried to push his groceries aside so no one would be inconvenienced. The bags tore accidentally. He's not the victim everyone thinks." A wave of angry mutters rolled through the crowd. Robert allowed George to respond. George spoke softly, voice trembling with emotion. "I was just unloading groceries, as I always do. She ripped them from my trunk and threw them onto the road. I never provoked her, never blocked the entire street. All I want is to feel safe in my own neighborhood." He paused, eyes wet. I shouldn't have to fear someone punishing me for being slow. The audience broke into sympathetic applause. Karen's face reddened. After the statements, Robert and the other board members retreated to a side room for a closed-door discussion. The tension in the hall was palpable. People whispered their guesses about the outcome. Many advocated Karen be stripped of her board position. Some even wanted the HOA to push for criminal charges. George sat quietly, exhaustion etched on his features. He appreciated how many neighbors supported him, but the emotional toll of recounting the incident weighed heavily. Brent patted his shoulder. Whatever happens, you've got this whole neighborhood behind you. After about 15 minutes, the board returned. Robert cleared his throat. We've reviewed all testimony and evidence. First, we want to publicly apologize to Mr. Millstone for the distress caused. Second, we find Ms. Hensley's behavior unacceptable, specifically, forcibly removing and damaging another resident's property and verbally attacking him due to his disability. A hush settled as Robert continued. Under the HOA bylaws, we can impose sanctions for misconduct by board members that violates community standards. Effective immediately, Ms. Hensley is suspended from her board duties pending a formal membership recall vote by the HOA. Should the membership vote for her removal, she'll lose her seat permanently. The crowd exhaled, relief mixing with satisfaction. Karen sputtered. You can't do that. This is a setup. I was only enforcing rules. But the board was unmoved. Robert's tone was firm. Additionally, we will refer any evidence of wrongdoing to local authorities, should Mr. Millstone wish to pursue legal action. Ms. Hensley, you're instructed not to harass Mr. Millstone or interfere with his parking in any way. Our guidelines clearly allow disabled residents to load or unload at the curb for short durations. Karen glared around, face pale, then grabbed her purse and stormed out. Gasps and murmurs followed her exit. The meeting ended soon after, with neighbors crowding George, offering encouraging words. In the days following the board's dramatic ruling, the neighbor-led curbside volunteer system took shape in earnest. A small text group was set up, and George had a list of phone numbers for immediate assistance. Each time he returned from therapy or errands, he'd message a short code, arriving in 5. And within minutes, 2 or 3 neighbors would appear. It worked seamlessly. The moment George pulled up, volunteers carried his grocery bags to his doorstep, while he managed only his crutches and a lighter load. The entire process sometimes took under 2 minutes, far faster than before. Not only did it spare George physical strain, but it also satisfied any lingering concerns about curbside parking length. The HOA took notice, praising the arrangement in its monthly newsletter. Robert penned a short note. The curbside volunteer system exemplifies the spirit of community we cherish here at Silverleaf Meadows. By assisting neighbors in need, we strengthen our bonds and uphold the values of compassion and respect. Residents beamed, proud that out of a cruel incident, something beautiful had emerged. Photographs of volunteers helping George began circulating on the same social media pages that once posted pictures of spilled groceries. The narrative had flipped from negativity to solidarity. Meanwhile, Karen maintained a low profile, not daring to confront the volunteers. Her fleeting attempts to discredit the system, grumbling it was a ridiculous spectacle, fell on deaf ears. The majority of neighbors saw it for what it was, a practical, heartwarming solution that showcased real neighborly care. A month after the incident, the HOA scheduled the membership recall vote to determine Karen's fate on the board. While her suspension remained in effect, the recall process gave all homeowners the chance to weigh in. The rumors swirling suggested a strong push to remove her. Karen, still defiant, distributed flyers defending herself. Don't let emotions override rules. Keep our streets clear and safe. Vote to keep Hensley on the board. But her pleas rang hollow. Most neighbors remembered the jarring images of groceries spilled on the road. They recognized Karen's typical approach, claiming to champion rules while ignoring basic empathy. On the day of the vote, attendance was high. Residents lined up to cast ballots in the clubhouse. Some, feeling sympathy, might have considered a second chance for Karen, had she shown genuine remorse or apologized. But her refusal to budge from her "I did nothing wrong" stance alienated even moderate supporters. That evening, the tally was announced. A resounding majority favored removing Karen from the board. nearly 80% of votes cast. Gasps of relief and applause filled the clubhouse. Robert read the final count, remarking that such a decisive outcome reflects our community's commitment to decency. Karen, present in the corner, turned pale. She stammered protests about witch hunts, but no one listened. Within minutes, she stormed out again, essentially sealing the end of her reign as the neighborhood's self-appointed enforcer. While the recall vote addressed Karen's HOA status, questions lingered about potential legal repercussions for her assault on George's groceries. A few neighbors urged George to file a police report, or at least consult an attorney. She destroyed your property, and it was clearly targeted, Brent argued. That's not just an HOA matter. George, however, hesitated. The emotional strain of reliving the incident, plus the potential stress of legal proceedings, didn't appeal to him. He found solace in the fact that the community had rallied around him, that Karen was stripped of her power, and that he no longer feared her interference. After deliberation, George decided not to press charges. He wrote a short statement, acknowledging that while Karen's act was deeply hurtful, he chose to focus on healing and moving forward, especially since the HOA had strongly condemned her behavior. Many neighbors respected his decision, praising his forgiveness. As for Karen, her post-recall life grew lonely. She rarely emerged in public spaces, refused to attend further HOA events, and was rumored to be quietly putting her house on the market. When a for sale sign popped up on her lawn, some neighbors felt a pang of pity, while others shrugged, believing she'd never truly fit into a neighborhood that valued kindness over petty rule enforcement. With Karen's exit from the board, Silverleaf Meadows found itself in a period of renewal. The vacant seat was filled by a warm-hearted neighbor named Danielle, who championed inclusive policies. The board introduced revised guidelines clarifying that disabled residents could pause curbside if needed, aligning with broader accessibility principles. For George, daily life improved dramatically. Gone were the days of anxious glances over his shoulder while unloading groceries. The volunteer system remained in effect, though some joked it was rarely necessary because many neighbors spontaneously helped him unasked. Once, upon returning from therapy, George found 3 neighbors already waiting at the curb with a cart, big smiles on their faces. It wasn't just George who benefited. The entire neighborhood embraced a friendlier outlook. People stepped forward to help older residents with yard work, or offered rides to neighbors who temporarily lost car access. The spirit of generosity became contagious, fueled by the memory of how they'd united to defend George. Robert Penfield wrote in the next HOA newsletter, "It's heartwarming to see how adversity has drawn us closer. By reaffirming our commitment to compassion, we ensure Silverleaf Meadows remains a place where all can feel truly at home." Midsummer approached, and the HOA decided to host a Community Unity Day in the Central Park, celebrating the renewed neighborly spirit. Families brought potluck dishes, kids played on the grassy field, and a small stage was set up for announcements or performances. George was invited to give a short speech, a notion that made him nervous, but he agreed, wanting to express his gratitude. On a bright Saturday morning, the park bustled with laughter and conversation. Tables overflowed with homemade salads, casseroles, and desserts. A local musician strummed upbeat tunes on a guitar. Children chased each other around the playground, while parents lounged on picnic blankets. George, wearing a simple collared shirt, took the stage with his crutches. A hush fell as he cleared his throat. "Thank you, everyone," he began softly. "When I moved here, I just wanted a peaceful life, never imagining the support I'd find after facing something so hurtful." He paused, emotion welling. "I'll never forget how you came to my defense, picked up my groceries, replaced what was lost, and set up a volunteer system to help me." Scattered applause and cheers erupted. George smiled, tears brimming. Sometimes, a negative act can spark incredible kindness. That's exactly what happened here. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. The crowd roared with appreciation. Many neighbors teared up, recalling the events that had united them. Danielle, the new board member, hopped on stage and presented George with a small plaque reading, "In recognition of neighborly spirit, to George Millstone, who inspires us all." The applause was thunderous. Halfway through the festivities, as George mingled with neighbors by the refreshment table, a hush fell at the park entrance. Karen had arrived, standing awkwardly at the periphery. She wore a subdued outfit, no longer the crisp blazer that once signaled her authority. Uncertain eyes scanned the crowd, as if she didn't expect to be welcomed. Many paused, tension briefly returning. What was Karen doing here? She'd effectively shunned community gatherings after being recalled. Some expected a confrontation, but to everyone's surprise, Karen took a deep breath and walked over to George. Face to face, she swallowed. George, I wanted to apologize, she stammered. Her cheeks flushed. I was out of line. You didn't deserve that. A cluster of neighbors watched, hearts pounding. George, exhaling slowly, gazed at her. It's good to hear you say, he replied gently, feeling a mix of relief and lingering pain. Karen fiddled with her purse strap. I guess I got carried away with the rules, and I let frustration blind me. I'm truly sorry for the harm I caused. She paused, seeming genuinely uneasy. I understand if you can't forgive me. George studied her expression, seeing a glimmer of sincerity. I appreciate your apology, he said after a moment. I won't lie, it hurt a lot. But life's too short for grudges. I accept it. Karen's shoulders sagged with relief. She nodded once, then retreated from the spotlight. Some neighbors gave her neutral nods. Others still seemed wary. She didn't linger, slipping away quietly soon after. The entire exchange left the crowd pensive, but there was a sense that perhaps even Karen realized she'd gone too far. Summer rolled into autumn, the leaves in Silverleaf meadows turning shades of red and gold. The months following Karen's apology saw no further outbursts. Though she remained somewhat of a loner, she kept to herself, not intervening in neighbors' affairs. Some speculated she'd eventually move away, but as time passed, the for sale sign never materialized. George continued thriving in the community. His volunteer system was rarely necessary now. Neighbors tended to appear on their own, a friendly face always ready to help. Even if no one was around, no one complained about him parking curbside for a few minutes. Do what you need, they would say. We've got your back. The board, now free of Karen's meddling, introduced more inclusive measures. They designated a second accessible curbside loading zone near the clubhouse for residents with mobility challenges. They also overhauled the association's complaint procedure, ensuring issues involving disabilities were handled with empathy and compliance to the law. At the next annual HOA meeting, Robert publicly commended the curbside volunteer system as a shining example of neighborly care, encouraging other communities to adopt similar approaches for residents with special needs. A local newspaper got wind of the story and published a short piece titled, "Neighborhood Transforms Conflict into Compassion," featuring a photo of George with volunteers. The piece garnered positive attention, further burnishing Silverleaf Meadows' reputation as a caring place to live. Looking back, many residents marveled at how a single act of cruelty, Karen's meltdown, throwing groceries, had ironically led to a blossoming of empathy. The day of that confrontation had felt like a low point, a brutal attack on the neighborhood's sense of decency. Yet the response was an overwhelming surge of kindness and communal support. George, reflecting on the incident a year later, felt a deep gratitude overshadowing the initial trauma. Of course, I wish it never happened, he told Brent one afternoon as they strolled through the park. But the outcome, it reaffirmed my faith in people's goodness. The volunteer system took root as a permanent fixture. Even new residents were briefed on it, though they rarely had to sign up if they didn't wish to. The mere presence of that structure, neighbors standing ready to help, symbolized a broader shift in mindset. More often, folks at Silverleaf Meadows stepped forward for any neighbor in need, whether it was unloading furniture, clearing snow from a walkway, or dropping off a warm meal during illness. Karen was no longer the face of the HOA, nor the dreaded authority figure on compliance. She'd become a cautionary tale about the perils of letting frustration and rigid rule-following morph into cruelty. Some said she was quietly remorseful, though her pride kept her from fully reintegrating. In time, her name became less a subject of daily conversation, more a footnote in the neighborhood's story of redemption. On an autumn evening, as the sun cast a golden glow over the houses, George paused by the curb. He'd just returned from the grocery store, a single bag in his trunk. Before he could even unbuckle his seatbelt, a young neighbor jogged over. "Need a hand, Mr. Millstone?" the teen asked eagerly. George smiled. "Sure, if you have a second." Thank you. In that small moment, one grocery bag carried across the threshold lay the essence of a community that had chosen compassion over hostility. And so, in Silverleaf Meadows, the memory of Karen's terrible outbursts served as a reminder that unity, empathy, and mutual assistance could triumph over even the darkest bursts of anger. The roads remained open for everyone, and no grocery bag was ever again hurled onto the asphalt in frustration.